Salutations, children. So today you should have read Rourke Chapter 5, and I just want to take today to hit some of the highlights from the chapter and really kind of start to look at the way colonial societies started to change in the early 18th century. So the way I'm going to structure this, I'm going to go through each of the three regions individually, and then at the end, I have a list of common trends that I want to go over as well. So first off, I'm going to start with New England. So New England is odd compared to the other two regions for a couple of reasons. Number one, New England, unlike the South and especially the Middle Colonies, didn't really have that much immigration. There were a couple of reasons why you didn't see a lot of immigrants to New England. First, Puritanism was kind of a turnoff. Even though by 1700, Puritanism was no longer enforced by law, the culture of New England was still heavily influenced by Puritanism. So if you were not Puritan, this would be kind of a turnoff, moving to a place where Puritanism was that was so dominant in the culture, where you really weren't going to get that much religious freedom if you moved there. Second, New England, compared to the Middle Colonies in the South, had more limited or restricted economic opportunity. And the main reason for this was because by 1700, New England had started to run out of land. Or let me rephrase that. There was a shortage of available land that could be purchased cheaply. There was undesirable land, and good land that was left was too expensive for the average person to buy. So there wasn't a whole lot of incentive for a person to move there because you were going to have a hard time buying land and getting set up economically to begin with. And if you weren't a Puritan, you'd have to adapt to this heavily Puritan culture. So a lot of people generally stayed away. However, New England's population did go up simply because of natural increase. The Puritan culture encouraged large families, and the climate of New England actually encouraged. The climate of New England was actually pretty good for health and infant mortality. Infant mortality rates were pretty low in New England, so unlike places like the South, there was you had a much higher chance of surviving childhood and infancy in New England than in anywhere else in the country, because since it was cooler, the deadly diseases that you had in the South, like typhoid, didn't really show up in New England. So because of the lack of disease, people lived longer. It was easier to have more kids, and your kids were more likely to survive because it was just a healthier place to live. Economically, New England was focused around primarily subsistence agriculture and increasingly trade. So most of the people in New England were subsistence farmers. They were basically running small family farms, growing enough food to feed themselves, and growing a little extra that they could then sell or barter with their neighbors or with other people in town to get things they couldn't grow or make themselves. New England's soil was too poor to allow for substantial agriculture where you'd have a lot of crops that you could sell for export. Really, it would allow you to provide for yourself and not a whole lot more. So again, when I say limited economic opportunity, New England was not the place you went to get rich. You didn't really have a lot of opportunities to get rich in New England. You went to New England if you wanted to basically have a nice, quiet life with your family. Increasingly, though, there was a growing financial and economic and political elite in New England because of its growing trade. New England became a major trading hub for the triangular trade or mercantilism that was being practiced by Great Britain. And because of this, larger merchants in New England started to get fantastically wealthy, predominantly those merchants in Boston. So this is where there starts to be some pretty extensive wealth in New England, but it's not evenly distributed. There's a pretty large wealth gap in New England where you've got these wealthy merchants in Boston who own most of the property, have most of the money, and basically because of that, control the colonial government through the colonial assemblies. And then you have everybody else. So there is a growing wealth inequality as trade starts to expand in New England. But for the most part, for the average person, you weren't really going to be fantastically wealthy or really have much of a shot at becoming wealthy. Okay, so moving on to the middle colonies. So in contrast to New England, the middle colonies had high immigration. Notably, the two most important groups immigrating to the U.S. in this period were the Germans and the Scots-Irish. And they typically flocked to the middle colonies for a couple of reasons. One, as we talked about earlier, the middle colonies were remarkably tolerant. So with the religious freedom and tolerance provided by the middle colonies, that was a big draw for foreigners, basically. Also, however, the middle colonies offered a lot of economic opportunity to people. I always get the impression of the middle colonies as being pretty entrepreneurial, where you weren't going to get necessarily super wealthy, but the odds here were pretty good for you to start a business or a farm and be successful at it. Again, not necessarily going to get fantastically wealthy, but the odds were good in the middle colonies for you to run your own business, run your own farm, be financially independent, and have a high standard of living. And kind of because of this entrepreneurial spirit and the economic opportunity provided by the middle colonies, you saw the smallest wealth gap in the middle colonies, where there was not as big a divide between rich and poor. It was much more of like a middle class type of society. Don't get me wrong, you still had rich, you still had poor, but it was not as sharp a division as you saw in New England or especially in the South. Also, unlike New England and the South, the middle colonies still had a lot of cheap land available in the 18th century. And that came from a number of reasons. For one, the unique types of governments of the middle colonies, where they were governed by private charters, like the Penn family governed Pennsylvania and basically owned Pennsylvania. So because of that, land remained land was not parceled out as quickly as it happened in New England or the South. And also, because of the better relationships of the middle colonies with Native Americans, frontier land was more acceptable. It was less dangerous because, again, the middle colonies, especially Pennsylvania, had pretty good relationships with Native Americans, where basically they respected their treaties with the natives. Since the natives knew that they could trust the middle colonies to not encroach upon their land, these frontier regions were actually pretty, I hesitate to use the term desirable because they were still far away from stuff, but they weren't nearly as dangerous than they were in other regions, and they were cheap. The middle colonies as well were you do see the development of major trading hubs in the middle colonies, notably New York and Philadelphia. And the middle colonies did trade a lot, most notably with food crops, notably flour and grain. But for me, I always take my biggest takeaway with the middle colonies as they developed really does come down to one, this highly diverse society in terms of both ethnicity and religion, and also this society that does have a lot of economic opportunity for people, and basically that was encouraging people to not necessarily take risks, but was encouraging people to put their best foot forward to try to reach for success, because there was a fairly good likelihood that you would get success in the middle colonies. Again, Benjamin Franklin is a great example of that. The Rourke mentions how he grew up in poverty in New England and just moved to the middle colonies, New York, and first New York and then Philadelphia, as a teenager, because he was attracted by what he saw, or what he perceived to be, the economic opportunity that was available there. And as we can see by Ben Franklin's success, he really is a good example of the opportunities provided by, or the opportunity available in the middle colonies. And Franklin's argumentation, or Franklin's discussion on his success, illustrates what a lot of sociologists term the Protestant work ethic, which really seems to be on high display in middle colony values, but also in American culture in general, particularly in the 1800s, which is this notion of people just tend to have this ingrained notion of working hard to earn the rewards that they want, while also practicing values of thrift, modesty, and virtue, where basically you work hard and you are entitled to the rewards you work for to earn, but you're also responsible. Like, you don't go out and blow all of your money. You don't get drunk and lazy and just become unproductive. You really do get to see this notion of the Protestant work ethic, where basically this notion of, if you put in the work now, you can reap rewards later, on display in the middle colonies. Again, Franklin has that quote, God gives all things to industry, where basically, again, it's the belief that working hard results in rewards. Okay, I feel like I went on a weird tangent, which is not too far off of what would happen if we were in person. I would go off on weird tangents and diatribes all the time. It's a social studies thing. Okay, on to the southern colonies. So the southern colonies were dominated and pretty much defined by slavery. So the South, like the middle colonies, did have a lot of immigration to it. The difference is the immigration to the South was not voluntary; it was forced, and that's because of the massive expansion of slavery and the slave trade. So the South was a very ethnically diverse place because of its incredibly large slave population, which in certain places outnumbered the white population. South Carolina especially stands out as having a slave population that absolutely dwarfs the white population. And because of this large slave population, a main priority for a lot of white Southerners was preventing slave revolts, particularly in places where there were a lot of slaves or where slaves outnumbered white people. Because, again, there was this fear that if the slaves rise up and tried to kill us, that would be bad. And in some places, they might actually be able to succeed. So a lot of the legal system, a lot of the legal characteristics that emerged around slavery emerged with this mindset of maintaining the existing social order and preventing slave revolts. Hence why you see the development of slave codes. Slave codes addressed a variety of things. For one, they addressed how slaves were expected to act towards and treat white people. And basically, the intention was to constantly reinforce slaves' subservience to whites. Other parts of the slave codes concerned things like what masters were allowed to do to their slaves or do with their slaves. One of the most striking examples of a slave code that develops over time were prohibitions or restrictions on slave literacy. Colonial and later on state governments really did not want their slaves being able to read or write. And there were legal prohibitions put in place which prohibited slave owners from teaching their slaves how to read or how to write. And the intention was if slaves were kept illiterate, it would be much harder for them to communicate with each other and therefore much harder to organize a large uprising. Now, there were still some instances where slaves would teach themselves how to read, or where you'd have masters who just violated the law and knowingly taught their slaves how to read. Frederick Douglass would be an example of that. I believe his master's wife taught him how to read when she recognized how just naturally intelligent he was. Okay. You would also have slave codes put in place to prevent masters and discourage masters from being what would be referred to at the time as unnecessarily cruel towards their slaves. Basically, the mindset was, if we're not super brutal or barbaric towards them, then maybe they won't want to rise up. Again, that was the mindset. I'm not sure how much of that really matters when you're still a slave, but that was the intention there. And also what's important with the slave codes is the establishment of of how to determine the slave status of children. And the system that developed in the South during this time was your slave status as a child was determined based on the status of your mother. So if your mother was a slave, then you were born a slave. If your mother was free, then you were free. So another way of looking at this, and the way this code was set up, was basically if your mother was black, you would be a slave, whereas if your mother was white, you'd be free. And the way this code was set up, it actually allowed for and made it a not uncommon occurrence for slave owners to have their own children as slaves, where since slave status was determined by the status of the mother, it was not uncommon for male slave owners to have children with their female slaves. And since the mother would be a slave, they would therefore have their own children as slaves, which I know sounds super messed up because it is super messed up. But that was part of the intention behind that policy, where even though interracial relationships were discouraged, where it was the case, when you had cases of white men having relationships with female slaves, people were more willing to look the other way. Whereas if it was a case of a black man having a relationship with a white woman, that was something that was definitely prohibited by the slave codes. Okay. Moving on. The South also boasted the highest amount of wealth inequality, or the largest wealth gap. And slavery really reinforced it. And when we're talking about the wealth gap, I'm really only talking about the white population, because the black population in the South was enslaved. They did not have wealth. Even though they were producing most of the wealth, they did not have any of the wealth. So within the white population of the South, there was a stark difference between the planters who owned large plantations, who owned large numbers of slaves, and who made most of the money, exported most of the cash crops, and consequently had the most political and social control and power and influence. Then you'd also have the yeomen, or these small white farmers, many of whom either did not own slaves or only owned a small number of slaves, and for the most part were not growing cash crops, would be more subsistence farmers. And then at the bottom of that hierarchy, you'd have poor whites, or landless whites, white people who did not own land or who owned very small plots of land. So there was a stark gap between the planters and the yeomen and poor whites. And that gap was reinforced and also enabled by slavery. What I mean by that is, one, as the Southern plantation agriculture-based economy and cash crop-based economy developed, the way you made money was by exporting larger and larger numbers of cash crops. And the only way to really do that profitably was through a system of forced labor, namely through either indentured servants, who you would have for a number of years before giving them their freedom, or slaves. Planters ultimately came to prefer slaves because, unlike an indentured servant, a slave was yours for life. And also, there were much fewer laws governing what you were allowed to do with slaves than what you were allowed to do with indentured servants. You could not be as harsh toward an indentured servant as you could a slave. So planters ultimately viewed slavery as more productive than using indentured servants. Slaves also came to serve as a visual representation or symbol of your wealth. Since slaves were really expensive, if you owned a lot of slaves, that was a way to represent to everybody else that you had a lot of money because you owned a lot of slaves. As slavery took root, though, there was also this, it made it much harder for yeomen and poorer whites to rise up to the planter class, because the way you rose to the planter class was owning a plantation and exporting and growing and exporting a large number of cash crops. But when the only way to really do that is to own slaves, and slaves are too expensive for most white people to afford, at least in the quantity you would need to run a plantation and enter the planter class, this planter class really became quite insular and became, in practice, if not in name, almost like a hereditary aristocracy that you would see in Europe. So, when I say that slavery enabled this wealth inequality, basically, the planter class was able to subdue or undermine any political unrest or challenges posed to their power and wealth by the poorer whites, by also imposing and creating this racial hierarchy where the yeomen and poor whites felt more of a bond with the planters and rich white people because they were all white, and therefore they had more rights than slaves and black people. So this racial hierarchy established by slavery ultimately helps mask and enable that wealth hierarchy that is also enabled and created by slavery. So yeah, there's that. And as I said, the Southern economy was based on plantation agriculture, focused around the growing of cash crops, notably tobacco in the Chesapeake region. So Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina focused on tobacco, while South Carolina and Georgia focused on rice and indigo. Okay. So to finish, let's go here. There are some common trends that were going on across all three colonial regions during the early 1700s. For one, all three regions of British North America experienced population growth, either through immigration or natural increase. Second, British North America had a relatively high standard of living. The average colonist had a higher standard of living than the average person back in England. And the way we would measure that was by their ability to consume. Colonists, the average colonist was able to enjoy a pretty high level of consumption, especially for the time period. And when we're talking about consumption, we're talking about how the average colonist could afford to buy wants in addition to their needs. So they didn't have to spend all of their money to just get by. They were wealthy enough and their standard of living was good enough that they were able to both have access to and be able to afford those luxury goods and things that, again, typical people in England would not really have access to or be able to afford. Thirdly, there were a number of religious changes going on in British North America at this time that have some pretty significant consequences, even though both trends are actually pretty different. So, one, you have this growing trend of secularization where religion is becoming less important pretty much across the board of British North America. Church membership was declining, and a larger number of people also who still attended church viewed it as more of a social function and less of a religious function. And priorities shifted more towards basically this world as opposed to people being concerned with the afterlife. And one of the main ways we see this trend take root is through the influence of the Enlightenment that's been going on in Europe. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Enlightenment was a trend in philosophy and politics and political science, and science as well, that was basically reintroducing or advocating the use of reason and critical thinking and logic to try to understand the world. And through the Enlightenment and a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers' views on religion, these views start to eventually trickle into British North America across the Atlantic. Notably, this idea of deism, which was a religious belief that became fairly popular in the colonies amongst the educated and intellectual class. So figures like, again, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison were members of that intellectual class, and they were all deists. Where basically the gist behind deism is a belief in a non-interventionist God, where they believe by looking at the world around them, they believe that because everything kind of functioned and worked, this was a sign that the world and the universe was set up with some kind of order by a creator, in this case, God. But they didn't believe in an interventionist God. So what that means is they didn't believe that God actively got involved in human affairs or answered prayers or things like that. The influence of deism on American culture, even though there were not a lot of deists in British North America, deism exerted a heavy influence on American culture because a lot of major figures who were critical of the development of the American political system were deists. Again, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, a lot of the founding fathers and people who were instrumental in setting up the Constitution and the American political system would be classified as deists. And deist thought and Enlightenment thought that was kind of coming into British North America in the 18th century would exert a heavy influence on the American political system and the way we would be set up. In contrast to the more secular impulse of the Enlightenment and deism, you also have the Great Awakening going on at this time, which was kind of a response to the perceived growing irreligiosity of colonial society. And the Great Awakening was the first major religious revival in American history. So when we're talking about a religious revival, basically this was people arguing and trying to bring religion back to the forefront of people's lives. The Great Awakening was significant for a number of reasons. So it didn't really address the trend or reverse the trend of people valuing religion less and less, but it did do a number of things. It did do a number of important things for American culture and society. So for starters, the Great Awakening was a non-denominational movement. So members of all these various sects of Christianity were participating in the Great Awakening. So not only did this serve to undermine traditional sources of authority and institutions in the established churches, particularly the more established ones like the Church of England, not only did this undermine their authority, it also served as a way to start binding people together and getting them united across not just denominations, but across the colonies as well. Since the Great Awakening happened throughout the entirety of British North America, this was a common experience that a lot of colonists took part in, from New England to the middle colonies to the southern colonies. And not only that, it brought people together from outside their own denominations as well. So the unity caused by the Great Awakening was ultimately the more significant factor, where it started the process of binding the colonies together, which is going to be kind of important when we get to our next unit, focusing on the American Revolution. As of right now, the colonies don't necessarily view themselves as a cohesive unit. They view themselves separately and crucially as part of the British Empire. And that's what I want to end this on. The colonists in British North America in the early 1700s enjoyed a high level of independence from Britain. Because of the distance between the colonies and Britain, they enjoyed a lot of self-government and a lot of home rule that the places closer to Britain did not experience or enjoy. And this early experience with self-government and home rule would prove important. But secondly, even though the colonists had this great deal of independence from Britain, they still viewed themselves as British. They were British subjects, and most of them were proud to be a part of the mighty British Empire. And that is a trend that we start to see come in conflict when Britain starts to take a more active role in colonial affairs following the 7 Years' War. And we'll look at that more next unit, but fundamentally, what is important is that the colonists and the British government have two very different views about the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. So with that note to end on, I know this was long. I know there was a lot to cover. I know I rambled a bit in there. But these are the general highlights of the development of colonial America in the early 18th century. If you have questions, again, if they can wait for discussion, you can keep them for discussion. You can also email me, and I will talk to you guys later.